Money has died again and again, and each time someone trusted it until the end. 100 Continental dollars for one coin of gold. A family carrying its savings to market in a sack, not a wallet. This is not a headline about inflation, it is a story about a promise breaking. One currency here died so completely, economists had to track its price through a rival company's stock. Not worth a Continental. Every soldier marching under George Washington got paid in paper the Continental Congress could not actually back with coin. In 1775, Congress began printing dollars to fund a war it had no power to tax for. The bills held their value at first, carried by nothing but revolutionary confidence. More paper chased the same goods every season, so merchants raised prices to match, and Congress printed even more to keep the army fed. This was essentially a bond. It promised future payment in specie, hard coin of gold or silver, once the war was won. By January 1781, it took about 100 Continental dollars to buy $1 in specie. A soldier collecting his back pay that spring found his wages bought him little more than a length of rope. James Madison wrote that year that paper money was worth only as much as the government's credit behind it, and that credit had nearly run out. In May 1781, merchants simply stopped accepting the bills at any price, and the Continental dollar ceased to circulate. 6 years later, delegates writing the Constitution banned states from ever issuing paper money as legal tender again, a scar from this collapse written into the nation's founding law. Today, a genuine Continental note sells to collectors for a few $100s, worth more as history than it ever was as money. A fortune made of paper. John Law arrived in Paris, a convicted killer with a royal pardon and a plan to replace France's shortage of gold with a bank that printed paper instead. In 1716, he opened the Banque Générale, and by 1719, he had merged it with the Mississippi Company, a firm holding exclusive rights to trade France's colonial territories in North America. Shares started around 500 livres. Investors poured in, so the price climbed toward 10,000 livres by the end of 1719, an increase of almost 1,900% in under a year. The word millionaire entered the French language to describe the servants and coachmen who got rich overnight. This is a speculative bubble, a price that rises because people expect it to keep rising, not because anything underneath it grew. In January 1720, investors began quietly converting paper gains into gold coin, and the share price stalled. Law printed more banknotes to prop it back up, so food prices in Paris jumped by as much as 60% within weeks. By December 1720, shares had collapsed back to 500 livres, exactly where they started. Law fled France disguised as a woman and died 9 years later in Venice, poor and forgotten. The man who invented paper wealth for France left with none of his own. A nation's money with no nation. It was currency backed by a country that had not yet won its independence, and might never exist at all. In March 1861, the newly formed Confederate States issued their first paper dollars, a promise to pay the bearer once the South achieved victory. Christopher Memminger, the Confederacy's Treasury Secretary, had no gold reserves and no functioning tax system to draw on, only cotton and a war to finance. So he did what every government in this position eventually does. He printed more. A bushel of salt that cost 80 cents in 1861 cost 30 Confederate dollars a year later. This is legal tender, money a government can force its own citizens and creditors to accept, whether or not they trust it. Confederate soldiers were paid in bills that lost value between payday and the next trip to market. By January 1865, $100 in Confederate paper bought just $1.70 in specie. Memminger resigned that summer, unable to hold the currency together. In April 1865, General Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and the bills in soldiers' pockets that week were worth less than a losing lottery ticket. Today, worn Confederate notes trade online as Civil War collectibles, worth more to a hobbyist now than they ever were to a soldier then. Money by the Sackful. In Bolivia in the early 1980s, families carried their money to market in sacks because no wallet could hold enough bills to buy groceries. From 1982 to 1985, Bolivia's peso boliviano lost value so fast that annual inflation reached roughly 25,000%. Government deficits, falling tin export prices, and a central bank that printed money to cover the gap fed each other in a loop. Bigger deficits meaning more printing meaning faster inflation meaning even less real tax revenue collected. In August 1985, newly elected President Victor Paz Estenssoro handed the problem to his planning minister, Gonzalo Sánchez de Lozada. Sánchez de Lozada applied what economists call shock therapy, cutting government spending and stopping the printing press all at once. once, fast enough that inflation had no runway left to climb. Within about 6 weeks, Bolivia's inflation rate fell from tens of thousands of percent to single digits. On January 1st, 1987, the government retired the peso boliviano entirely, replacing it with a new boliviano at a rate of 1 million old pesos for one new one. Sanchez de Losada's shock plan became a model economists later pointed to across Latin America and Eastern Europe. He would go on to be elected president of Bolivia himself in 1993. Worth less by the hour. In November 2008, Zimbabwe's central bank printed a banknote worth $100 trillion, the largest denomination any government has ever issued. Official price statistics had already stopped in July because prices moved too fast to record, so economists tracked the real collapse a different way, through the price of Old Mutual, an insurance company whose shares traded in both Harare and London on the same day, letting analysts infer the black market exchange rate from the gap between the two prices. A black market exchange rate is simply the price people actually pay in secret once the official price stops meaning anything. At the peak, estimates put monthly inflation near 80 billion %, with prices doubling roughly every 24 hours. Gideon Gono, the central bank governor whose signature appeared on the trillion-dollar notes, kept authorizing larger denominations even as each one lost most of its meaning within days of release. $100 trillion at issuance was already worth only a fraction of what its number implied, and falling by the hour. By early 2009, ordinary Zimbabweans had already started paying each other in American dollars and South African rand, ignoring their own currency entirely. The government caught up to the street that April, retiring the Zimbabwean dollar for good. The note built to end all zeros never even circulated for half a year. Too many zeros to count. Israel's old shekel had multiplied its zeros so fast that, by the early 80s, bank computers struggled to display account balances correctly. By 1984, annual inflation was closing in on 450%, on pace to pass 1,000% within a year. The root cause was wage indexation, a system where pay automatically rose to match past price increases, which then pushed prices higher again, in a loop with no natural end. In September 1984, Israel's rival political parties, Labor and Likud, formed an unusual national unity government under Prime Minister Shimon Peres, just to hold together long enough to fix it. Finance Minister Yitzhak Modai and economist Michael Bruno designed a plan that froze wages, prices, and the exchange rate simultaneously in July 1985. Betting that stopping all three at once would break the cycle before anyone could game it. The gamble worked. Inflation fell from over 400% to under 20% within 2 years. On September 4th, 1985, Israel pulled the old shekel from circulation and introduced the new shekel, worth exactly 1,000 of the old ones. Labor and Likud, rivals before and after, agreed on almost nothing else that decade, but for one summer, saving the shekel was worth the truce. A race to save the rubles. For anyone who watched the news in 1991, the red flag coming down over the Kremlin was the visible half of this story. The ruble's death was the invisible half. In December 1991, the Soviet ruble lost the empire that had printed it. 15 new countries emerged from the collapse, and for a while, all of them kept using the same ruble, issued by multiple central banks with no single authority in charge. The money supply exploded, so prices in Russia rose by more than 2,000% in 1992 alone. This is devaluation taken to its extreme. A currency losing worth so fast that yesterday's savings barely buy today's groceries. Viktor Gerashenko, chairman of Russia's central bank, pushed through a reform in July 1993 to cut Russia loose from the former Soviet republics still printing ruble notes of their own. Citizens were given 2 weeks, from late July to early August, to trade in their old Soviet-era notes for new Russian ones, with a cap of 35,000 old rubles per person. People who had spent decades saving in state bank accounts watched their deposits shrink to a fraction of their value that summer. Anger over the limit spilled into the press and parliament. The word ruble survived, but the Soviet ruble itself was gone, replaced piece by piece as each former republic built its own money. 6 plans and a fake currency. Brazil tried 6 different stabilization plans between 1986 and 1993, and every single one failed within months. Each plan froze prices, renamed the currency, or cut zeros off the bills, so inflation would pause briefly and then roar back once people adjusted their expectations. By June 1994, annual inflation had reached almost 5,000%. The government's next idea sounded almost too simple. Instead of launching another new currency, it created a fake one that nobody could actually spend. This unit, called the URV, existed only on paper and computer screens, while people kept paying in the old, inflated Cruzeiro Real. Prices, wages, and contracts were all converted into URV terms at the same time, so everyone in the economy adjusted to a stable number before a single new bill was ever printed. Finance Minister Fernando Henrique Cardoso oversaw the plan. On July 1st, 1994, the URV quietly became a real currency, the Brazilian real, converting at 2,750 Cruzeiros Reais to 1. By December, annual inflation had collapsed to under 1,000%, down from nearly 5,000, and within a year it was down to 22%. Brazil had beaten hyperinflation without ever printing a single note of the currency that actually did the work. 14 zeros and counting. By 2018, a loaf of bread in Caracas needed a stack of banknotes just to cover the price. After years of Venezuela's bolivar losing value, the government had already removed 3 zeros from the currency back in 2008, renaming it the Bolivar Fuerte, the strong bolivar. It did not stay strong. Falling oil prices gutted government revenue, so the state kept the presses running to close the gap, which pushed prices higher, which meant the state needed to print even more just to keep functioning. This is redenomination, cutting zeros off a currency without changing what it is actually worth underneath. In August 2018, President Nicolas Maduro announced a second redenomination, removing 5 more zeros and introducing the Bolivar Soberano, equal to 100,000 Bolivares Fuertes. Economist Steve Hanke compared it to plastic surgery. The appearance changes, but nothing underneath actually does. The International Monetary Fund had projected inflation could reach 1,000,000% that year. 3 years later, the government cut 6 more zeros and introduced yet another currency, the Bolivar Digital. Between 2008 and 2021, Venezuela's Bolivar lost 14 zeros in total, and dollars quietly took over daily life anyway. Which of these currencies would you have spotted collapsing in time to get out? Tell us in the comments and subscribe for the next one.